Listen, when you're depressed, you are so fatigued, you don't even have energy to do the smallest things, like shower. I would go for days, literally even weeks, without showering. Like, you can smell yourself and you can see the shower is right there, but like, it seems like such an impossible task. It's like your world loses color all of a sudden. So everything is just dark. Suicide is so misunderstood to be an act of selfishness. But as someone who's been through it, I remember feeling like when I started to have these thoughts, I started to notice that like anytime I'm able to sleep, in that hour, maybe I just had a bit of a break from this reality of mine, this depressed, anxious reality of mine. And I think for me, now that I think about it in hindsight, that's when I started really to contemplate the idea of death, because I was like, wow, maybe if I'm just in a permanent state of sleep, then I don't have to go through this. I felt like it might be easier for my family to deal with a dead Waringa than deal with the shell of the person I had become. My name is Waringa Kamau, and I am a storyteller, and I'm also someone who has battled depression, anxiety, and substance abuse for about 5 years. I spend my life now talking about mental health and just doing a lot of advocacy work and storytelling and telling honest and vulnerable stories around mental health, because I think it's very, very important that we normalize these conversations in our societies, in our families, with our friends, in our workspaces, just so, I don't know, we're able to care for each other better, to see each other when someone is struggling, and to know how to support each other. And most importantly, so that people are not suffering in silence, which was the case for me for a very long time. I was going through the depression, the anxiety, the substance abuse in silence, kind of like in the shadows. I wasn't telling anyone. And honestly, like thinking back, I shouldn't have been suffering for that long if I had actually like opened up about it, but I didn't. You know, I was scared, I guess, of being judged, of being shamed. I don't know, there's this kind of stigma that exists when it comes to mental health. So I guess when you're the one who's going through it, it becomes very difficult for you to just come out and say, or at least for me, I felt very scared to just come out and tell people that, hey, I think I might be depressed, or hey, I'm actually hooked on weed and alcohol and I don't know how to stop myself, because I'm just like, I felt so ashamed, first of all, that I was even in that situation. But now when I think about it in retrospect, I'm like, I shouldn't have been feeling that way, because it's actually an illness, you know? So like depression is an illness, anxiety is an illness, substance abuse is oftentimes kind of a manifestation of an illness, which in my case, the substance abuse was a manifestation of the depression and the anxiety, because I was using the substances to cope. So here I was, absolutely depressed, and I'm trying to figure it out by myself. Like, you don't have the skill set. Like, you're the patient. You also don't have the skill set to fix your own self. Like, if you have a broken leg, for example, you don't sit in your house and you're like, yeah, it's just gonna fix itself. No, you actually like go to a doctor and they help you fix it. So I guess at the time, I also just didn't realize that, hey, it's an illness and you can actually go to a doctor, i.e. a psychiatrist, and they can actually put you on your healing journey. And I guess that's why it's really important to also talk about this thing, so that people who might be going through some kind of mental health illness or the other become aware that actually, number one, you're unwell, like you're actually unwell. And number two, you can go to a doctor and they can help you recover instead of you sitting in your house trying to fix it yourself. No, the stereotypes are many when it comes to mental health. Like sometimes you'll hear someone telling you, oh yeah, you're not depressed. By the way, that is a white people illness. Like you are actually not depressed. And you're like, no, you mean to tell me this very real experience I'm having, you're just trying to kind of, I don't know, dismiss it. No, like I'm actually unwell. So mental health illnesses, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, like whatever it is, it's like diabetes, it's like cancer, it's like kidney failure, it's an illness, you know, and it's not a white people illness. Like you wouldn't think, oh yeah, cancer, that's a white people illness. No, it's anyone is game, you know what I mean? And then other stereotypes I've had is like people will dismiss the fact that you're saying you're unwell because of what they're seeing on the outside, you know? So maybe someone is looking at you thinking, oh yeah, this person, I don't know, is married, they have a wife and kids, they, I don't know, have gone to school, they, I don't know, have a job, like whatever it is, you know? So sometimes people are looking at you and saying, you're not actually depressed because you have everything. But I always try to, I don't know, emphasize that like having things or like material possessions or whatever you're seeing on the outside does not actually equate to mental well-being. You know, things is not equal to being mentally okay. Yeah. So, and then another one that I hear a lot is, and this one is popular in Africa, people will tell you, hey, uyu alirogwa. Like, you know, that one, that one is sorcery. That one was bewitched or something like that. I don't know, there's this notion that sometimes having a mental health illness is, I guess, evidence of you having been bewitched, or there's just some kind of sorcery happening. So with that in mind, everyone is just like, yeah, stay away from us. Like, we don't want anything to do with you. And because it's witchcraft, like that can be fixed. Like, we're just going to leave it to Jesus. Yes, we're going to leave things to Jesus. But also when you have a mental health illness, please go to the hospital. Like, it can be fixed. It really can be fixed. Go see a psychiatrist. Don't believe that it's witchcraft. And you know, sometimes people will just take their mentally unwell people for prayers, and like, that's fine, but also realize that it's an illness. Please go seek actual professional help. So thinking back, I think everything for me started in around 2017. Thereabout is when I started to notice changes in myself that made me think, maybe something is wrong. So just, for example, I started to notice that like I really had difficulty getting out of bed. And that, I know that sounds very like trivial, but like when you're depressed, or when you're depressed, when you're facing a mental health illness, in my case, depression and anxiety, getting out of bed sometimes can be very difficult. Like on a normal day, you don't even think about it. Like your alarm goes off and you're like, yeah, let's start the day. But like when you're depressed, for me, it felt like my body just weighed like a ton of bricks. I felt like I was just all of a sudden like the weight of an elephant, and I just couldn't get up. I just couldn't get myself to get out of bed. I mean, like at my worst, I think I spent close to 2 months in bed, you know, and that was a red flag for me. Another thing I started to notice is I was just like mentally, I was not clear. Like I was always very foggy, you know, like, you know how normally you can see one thought in your mind and like hold it to the end. When you're depressed, at least for me, because I was dealing with both depression and anxiety, it felt like my mind was like always in shambles. Like it was just neither here nor there. It felt like it was just constantly on overdrive. I couldn't think straight. I was so forgetful, for example. Like you would tell me something now, and by midday or like in the next 2 hours, I've already forgotten it, because just my mind was always so neither here nor there. Just that mental fatigue, I think is what I can call it. Like I just was always physically fatigued, but also very mentally fatigued. Another thing I also started to notice was an uptick in my use of substances. Okay, so you know, usually we like to call ourselves like casual drinkers. So yeah, I'm a casual drinker. I only drink with friends on weekends. But then I started to notice that like, okay, I'm drinking every day. And then that progressed to I'm drinking like by the hour. And then that progressed to by the time I'm waking up, the first thing I want to do is like drink. Okay, like I wake up, I open my eyes like this and I'm like, yeah, I need a glass of wine or something like that. So that for me was like a big red flag, is when I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not actually okay. Like it can be that I'm waking up and the first thing I want to do is like drink, you know? And I mean, I was hooked on alcohol and I was also hooked on weed. I started now to notice that like, oh my gosh, I'm doing maybe 4 to 6 joints a day. That's ridiculous. I think by anyone's standards, that's a lot of weed for one person on a daily, you know? That's when I was like, okay, I think there might be a problem here. And then another thing I started to notice is, this was when now my anxiety was getting really bad. I started this thing where I would find myself just unconsciously plucking out hair. I know it's called trichotillomania. I think I said it right, but like that's the word, I think. It's an actual condition where you have this irresistible, uncontrollable urge to just like pull out your hair. And that for me used to be when I find myself in like an anxious episode. Anxiety will manifest itself differently for different people. So that was one of the ways it was manifesting itself for me, is that I would just like find myself plucking hair. Now I've been able to stop, but yeah, that was, right now if you tell me to pluck out hair, like I can't. But then I don't even know what it was, but I would just like find myself tagging at and just pulling hair, I still have a few gaps in my head, but like it's slowly growing back. But yeah, and then another thing I started to notice is I was drastically losing weight, like ridiculously quickly. And that's because I wasn't eating. Sometimes when people are depressed, it goes one of two ways. Either you absolutely completely lose all your appetite, which was the case for me. Like, to put it in context, I would struggle, those little things of yogurt, I would struggle to finish one. Like, I would take a spoon and I'm done. Or like a banana, I would eat maybe one banana for like 3 days. So I was really losing a lot of weight. But sometimes for other people, they tend to eat more when they're going through depression. I guess it's like some comforting. I guess it's kind of comforting for them. But yeah, for me, it was just like a drastic weight loss season for me. Like, I went from like what I am to like, I was so tiny. Yeah, and then another thing that I started to notice in myself, and I guess this one was the climax where I was just like, oh my gosh, yeah, something is definitely wrong, is when I then started to have thoughts of self-harm, i.e. you start to have like suicidal thoughts. And when those come, it's like, you know how when you're rolling something down a hill, it starts slowly, and then before you know it's like, boom. So that's how, for me, in my experience, having suicidal thoughts were. It just comes in your mind one day, and before you know it, it's all you're thinking about. It just consumes you. And yeah, so that's when I started to have those thoughts, tried multiple times. One time the one time I thought I had a foolproof plan, it was so close to working, and then I woke up in a hospital later and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a whole other conversation. Like, when you wake up from a failed attempt, I don't know why I'm laughing, but like now, now in hindsight, I guess you can laugh about it. So yeah, that was the pinnacle of me realizing that I wasn't okay, was having these thoughts of self-harm, and not just having the thoughts, but then taking it a step further where I was now executing, like trying to actually do it, and persistently. This one fails, you're like, okay, let's do this. It fails, you're like, okay, let's do this. It fails, you're like, okay, now let me improve upon method number 2, that kind of thing. That's when you know, like, things have gone like south, like you desperately actually need help. So yeah, so oftentimes people wonder like what actually causes someone to have depression, or someone to have anxiety, or someone to resort to substances as a way to get by. So I'll say that it's usually different for different people. There's usually different triggers for different people, and I can only speak from my experience. So for me, I'll say, so things I think for me started when I lost my brother. So at the time when that happened, it was a very complicated situation, because at the time I hadn't moved back to Kenya yet. I was still in the US. And it was a really hectic situation, because I was still I had some immigration paperwork, like legal paperwork, that was still processing, which meant that if I left the States, I would not have been able to go back at the time. So due to that complication, I wasn't able to, I guess, come home and, attend the funeral and just grieve with my family and, that kind of thing. So at the time, I didn't realize how much that impacted me until later, when things kind of blew up and I got to now being very deeply depressed and anxious and, over relying on substances to get through life. I didn't realize in the moment that this would actually take a big toll on me. And I think now is when I really understand and appreciate how important it is to actually go through feelings when they present themselves. Like if it's a moment to grieve, actually take time to grieve, because I didn't do that. And I think because I was so far, I guess I hadn't really quite accepted that it wasn't real. You know how sometimes your mind knows something, but like your heart hasn't quite caught on? I think that was the situation for me, because it's only actually this year, believe it or not, I guess 5 years later, that I actually dealt with my brother's passing. It's 5 years later that I actually went to his gravesite. It's 5 years later that I actually had a good cry about it, thanks to therapy. My therapist was able to help me understand that like this actually happened and you need to deal with it, because I had developed this nasty habit of just bottling things. Something happens and you tie it in a nice little box and you put it inside and you never quite deal with things. And in therapy, I got to open up those nice little boxes and deal with the nasty things inside. And one of the things I had to deal with was actually confronting the fact that my brother had passed away, and actually feel the feels and deal with it. So that was one of the things that I was able to understand in hindsight. And then another thing that was a stressor for me was I was in the middle of so many life transitions. So at this time when I'm losing my brother, I was also trying to figure out life in terms of like, where was I actually going to be? As I mentioned, I was in the middle of renewing legal paperwork, immigration paperwork in the States. So it was between me and my job, we were trying to figure out, okay, are you gonna be able to stay in the US and continue working? Are you gonna lose your job? Are you gonna move back to Kenya with your job or without your job? Are you gonna, it was a lot of unknowns that I was dealing with. And I guess everything was just happening at the same time, and it was just, I don't know, I guess everyone has their limits, but for me, between the loss and just the major life transitions that I was experiencing, it was just a bit much. And then it so happened that eventually I did end up moving back. But then you see, there's this kind of reverse culture shock that happens when you move back, so how do I explain it? You move back, you're used to things in one way, and then suddenly you're back, and it's not what you're used to, so to speak. And oftentimes it's often misunderstood, but it can be really lonely. Actually, that's the word. For me, moving back was lonely in many ways. For one, I had left all my friends, where I was moving from. So I left Kenya when I was quite young. I was, I think, 16 going on 17. So by the time I'm coming back home, a lot of the friends that I had back then, you've grown apart, people have grown in different ways. And, I basically just didn't have friends. I didn't have that many friends when I first moved back. And that can be really lonely, because everyone that I had then, built close bonds and relationships with, I had left them back, where I was coming from. So that took a bit of a toll on me, the first year of being back and just trying to figure things out. And I think that also kind of put me in a bit of a depression as well, because you're now trying to start life afresh, that's what it was, because I moved back with my everything, and now it's okay, now I have to start life afresh here, So that was a bit stressful as well. And then going back to the thing of sometimes you go through things and you don't quite address them, and I had a few of those, I guess, traumatic events that happen quite young in your childhood that you never quite address, but then you don't quite realize that these things are taking a toll on you as an adult, So so as I went through therapy and we start to unpack all those things and deal with them, now dealing with them, I'm able to actually be better and start to, I'm not always depressed or anxious or relying even on substances anymore. Why? Because I've been going to therapy, I've been seeing a psychiatrist, so you're able to deal with those. But yeah, those are some of the things that were in play for me. Another thing that was at play was that, okay, so now I've moved back to Kenya and, I've now adjusted to life here. Then COVID comes, and with COVID came many things and many shockers to the system, to many of us. I think everybody was affected in one way or the other by COVID. So for me, number one, I became part of that global statistic of people who lost their jobs. So I've moved back to Kenya. I'm just starting to get my footing, and then voila, I'm laid off from my job. So essentially it's like having a rug just pulled from under your feet, and I was like, oh my God, now what? Then when that is going on, my whole family literally gets COVID. So my mom, my dad, my brother, his wife, everybody gets COVID except me. And let me tell you, that was a really stressful time in my life because both my parents had to be in a hospital. They're a bit older, so kind of their bodies didn't take the COVID very well. So they had to actually be in hospital and hooked up to things. It was quite scary having to see your loved ones through glass. Did everyone just have COVID? Did we just have both parents in hospital? And that's what I mean. Compartmentalizing things is a nasty habit. Because then the more you compartmentalize things and you just bottle things in, one day it will just explode. And it's nasty. It's nasty when that happens. But thankfully, all of them were better at the end. But you see, this whole time, you already have your own issues brewing within yourself, like your work pressures, now you've become a caregiver to your whole family. It was just roller coaster after roller coaster after roller coaster. And yeah, I know sometimes we tend to trivialize people's experiences. Sometimes someone can tell you, oh, this happened to me. And you just shrug it off. You're like, oh, wow, that is actually not such a big deal. But I think sometimes you just need to hear what people are telling you, because you don't know how this one thing that you're seeing is trivial. You don't know how that trivial has affected this person. And you also don't know what else they're probably dealing with in their life, that this one thing might just be the little thing that what is it, the straw that breaks the camel's back, that kind of thing. Because I feel like sometimes not everything is a competition, especially suffering. Suffering is not a competition. You don't have to be sitting there oh yeah, you don't have it bad as this person, or this person definitely has it worse than you. No, it's actually, it's not a contest, and pain is never a contest, So anytime someone comes and tells you, this thing is affecting me in this way, just listen, just listen to them and be there for them, and just be kind. Sometimes maybe all they need is a listening ear. Sometimes maybe all they need is someone to just say, I hear you, And oftentimes that's enough. Just don't invalidate someone's experience just because, I guess, of where you're coming from, or because you don't understand maybe the depth of it or how that particular thing has hit that person. Because we all take things very differently. One person can deal with grief in a week. Another person, like me, it will take them 5 years to deal with it, So when I started to notice the changes that were happening in myself, I started to think, surely you're not okay. But then I didn't have the language for it. I didn't know exactly what was wrong, okay? So I started on Google. I started by going to Google, and I was like, I'd literally just type exactly what I'm feeling. Why am I not able to get out of bed? Or why am I drinking too much? Or why am I pulling out my hair? Or why am I constantly mentally fatigued? I'm foggy. Why don't I have mental clarity? So I started to just do my own research. And the more I started to dig and dig and dig, the word depression was just popping in a lot of my Google results. And I was like, what? You mean I'm depressed? Me? you know? And honestly, I didn't tell anyone. Yes, I'm unwell. I'm experiencing all these things. It's quite uncomfortable to be feeling all these things at the same time. And I was like, okay, I just kept quiet. I didn't share. In part, I was scared of maybe being misunderstood. I was scared of I don't know, being judged. I was afraid of what that would sound like to people, what that would mean, like, okay, so I'm depressed. And then, like, do people like me get depressed? Like, then what happens? Like, am I crazy? At one point, honestly, I started to think that I was losing it, especially when I was having this mental fogginess. Honestly, it felt like my brain was like a ball of spaghetti, like just messed up and things are everywhere, And then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually losing it, So you're just starting to wonder, like, who do I go to? What do I say? So honestly, for the longest time, I didn't tell anyone. And I was just trying to fix things by myself. But you know what? As with many things in life, you can't keep things hidden for too long. So the longer I'm thinking that I'm just going to sit on this information or sit on these suspicions I'm having that maybe I have a mental health illness, the worse I was actually getting. Like, time was just passing. Like, time is not going to stop so that you can figure it out. And as time is passing, so is your illness intensifying. So my symptoms went from not being able to leave bed for a week to not being able to leave bed for 2 weeks, to I'm not feeling very productive for a couple of days to I'm just going to resign from my job because I'm very incapable of doing it. Listen, when you're depressed, you are so fatigued, you don't even have energy to do the smallest things, like shower. So I would go for days, literally even weeks, without showering. Like, you can smell yourself. You literally can smell yourself, and you can see the shower is right there. But like, you don't have the energy, the way, like, you can't. It seems like such an impossible task. It's like your world loses color all of a sudden. So everything is just dark. Because actually, that's the best way to sometimes describe depression. It's like you're just in a deep, dark hole. That's often what depression feels like. You're just by yourself in this very deep, dark hole. And there's no desire to do anything. You're not feeling like the person you used to be. Oftentimes, like, your confidence or just your self-esteem will really go down. And that was something I actually experienced a lot. And it also became an issue for me at work. Because let me tell you, depression does a fantastic job of like lying to you, in the sense that it makes you believe like you are nothing, you are not good for anything, there's nothing left for you in the world. And when that becomes the only message you're hearing, at some point you'll start to believe it. So I went from being this very like confident, vibrant person to all of a sudden I'm just like meh. Like I don't know, I felt like I was a dead person walking. Honestly. Like, if I can show you pictures of myself from when I was really bad to now, it's like different people. Because the life is literally sucked out of you by the depression. Depression is horrible, and it's like the biggest liar, because it will lie to you and just make you feel like such a loser. So when depression starts to lie to you and starts making you feel like you're not actually capable of doing anything, if at that point in time you're working, it becomes very difficult to still excel at that job. So like for me, I found it very difficult to still keep doing my job when I was kind of in the depths of the depression, because here I was not feeling like I'm capable to do anything. On top of the fact that I'm constantly fatigued, both physically and mentally. I'm in this position where I'm very, very forgetful. Like, I'm competing with a goldfish when it comes to memory. So then at work, that will start to show, because you're becoming a bit sloppy, like you're not all the way there. Remember, depression, anxiety, they are mental illnesses, which means at the time that you're battling them and maybe you're in the depths of it, literally, your mind is unwell. So you're not gonna be able to do things sometimes to the level that you want to do them or the way that you know you can do them. But without that understanding, you begin to, I don't know, shame yourself, to judge yourself. You're so hard on yourself. And maybe even others too might be really hard on you because maybe they too don't have that understanding that actually this person is not just being sloppy. This person is just not being incompetent. They're actually unwell, you know? So it's so important that we normalize these conversations at work too, so that even your teammates, your co-workers, your managers are able to even just be there for people on their teams better, and not just being like, oh yeah, we have to fire this person, they're not doing well, but just understanding that maybe this person is actually unwell. What they need is some time to get better, then they'll be back to who they are. Because also, having a mental health illness doesn't mean you're all of a sudden incapable. Like when someone is going through a mental health illness and they're on the proper treatment plan, you're actually just fine. It's not like a disability. You know, you're actually just fine when you're on the proper treatment plan. The problem is when you're not. Like you're not getting the medical care that you actually need. That's when it can be a bit, you know, can take a bit of a toll excessively on you. When you're going through depression and you get to that stage where you're starting to think about taking your own life, I think that's usually the biggest glaring sign, like, yeah, it's not okay, it's not okay, it's not okay, like, do something about the situation. But for me, it was so weird to even be having those thoughts, because no one just sits down and you start thinking about, oh yeah, this is how I'm gonna do it. I actually wanna take my own life, and this is how I'm gonna do it. Like, many of us are so scared of death. Like, even the thought of it, the mention of it, you're just, you know, you want to end that conversation. But when you're depressed, when you're in that deep dark hole, you know it's bad when death is looking like the only solution that you have. And I think sometimes people tend to really misunderstand suicide. Because they're like, why would this person do it? Or why would someone be so selfish? Or just why, you know? It's not an act of selfishness. Like, suicide is so misunderstood to be an act of selfishness. But as someone who's been through it, I can tell you it's actually not. So like for me, I remember feeling like when I started to have these thoughts, I started to notice that like anytime I'm able to sleep, I'm okay for that hour that I've been able to sleep. And I think the minute I started having those thoughts, I started to see, I've slept for an hour, and in that hour, maybe I just had a bit of a break from this reality of mine, this depressed, anxious reality of mine. And I think for me, now that I think about it in hindsight, that's when I started really to contemplate the idea of death, because I was like, wow, maybe if I'm just in a permanent state of sleep, then I don't have to go through this. Maybe that's just the actual only way that I can end this suffering. Because also at the same time, I guess I was also just frustrated because all the things that I was trying to do to fix myself were not working. And so I guess I just got to a point where I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is actually just the only solution that I have left. And another way that people think about suicide, I guess in the context of it being an act of selfishness, is how it will affect your family, your loved ones, your friends. And honestly, when I was in that season of my life, yeah, I did think about it. But for me, the way in which I thought about it was, I felt like, and I know this might be so twisted now in hindsight, but in that moment, I felt like it might be easier for my family to deal with a dead Waringa than deal with the shell of the person I had become. Like, I was so ashamed of who I had become. And I guess that also just adds to this shame that's there with having a mental health illness. I was like, okay, so no, like nobody can find out that I'm depressed. Nobody can find out that I'm now like hooked on alcohol and weed, you know, like no one is proud of being an addict, you know. No one is proud of, for me in that moment, I was just like, I wasn't proud of who I had become. I also just hadn't come to a place of understanding that I was unwell. And so for me, when you factor in like friends and family and just loved ones, I felt like it's just gonna be easier on them to deal with a dead me than deal with this person that even I don't understand. And I definitely don't like what I've become. So this made sense for me, for myself and others. And I know it might not make sense for maybe others who might be listening to this, and that's the thing, like, that's the thing you have to understand. Like, depression actually affects also how you see things, how you perceive things. It affects your view of reality. Like the way you see life when you're depressed, because you're seeing things through your lens of depression, sometimes you see things in a very twisted way. I started to contemplate the idea, and I actually started to attempt. And then one night, I kind of executed what I thought was going to be a very foolproof plan. And I was sure. I was like, yeah, this is going to work. Because I had tried that particular method like once or twice before, and I had improved on it, so to speak. I know that's dark, but like I had improved on it to the point where when I was now executing it that particular night, I was like, yeah, this for sure is gonna work, because I had improved on it, as I said. But like, I guess when it's not your time, it's not your time. So it didn't work. But I ended up in a hospital, I think close to 10 hours later. And the doctors honestly thought it was a miracle that I was still alive, to be honest, because counting just how long I had been unconscious for before it was realized that my mom is the one who sounded the alarm. So she says that it's my good phone habits that saved me. So she tried to call me. She had been trying to call me, and I wasn't picking up my phone. But with me, usually, if you try to call me, if I can't answer you right away, I'll just send you a message right away and be like, I can't answer the phone right now, but I'll call you like in an hour or two. And like, that's just me. So when she didn't get that, she was like, oh, okay, that's odd. So a few hours later, she tries again, nothing. Then she tries again a third time. Now at this point, it's the next day, nothing. And she's like, something is wrong. So she sounded the alarm and sent just someone to come to my apartment and figure out like, where's this girl? Like, why isn't she not picking the phone? So yeah, that's when it was discovered that, oh my gosh, I had attempted suicide. Yeah, I hear that when the paramedics arrived and, you know, they're trying to resuscitate you and rush you to the hospital, I hear that I was kind of already stiff. Like even when they were trying to, because I lived on 4th floor of my building and we didn't have a lift in that building where I lived at the time. So they physically have to put you on the stretcher and then take you down the stairs. But even to put me on the thing, I wasn't quite foldable, like, because I had kind of started to become stiff. So it is kind of a miracle that I'm still here, that I'm alive, because my body had taken quite a beating. I think it was this leg. Even when I started to recover and came to like, and now could walk again, like could be strong enough to like get up and get out of bed, this leg wasn't functioning quite well. Like I was so wobbly, you know, because it had actually gone stiff. Like, you know what I mean? So many times I find myself thinking that I really did get a second chance. Like, I guess God wasn't done with me just yet. And I guess that's why I'm so passionate and so keen to talk about mental health and to really make noise about mental health and make it something that we are comfortable to talk about, especially so that those who are going through it don't have to be like suffering and struggling and battling in silence like I did. And get to that point where they're dead, well, we could have helped them, you know? Because for me, once everything wasn't a big secret anymore, is when I actually embarked on my healing journey. Let me tell you, the first thing that comes to your mind, well, the first thing that came to my mind in that moment where I woke up is just like, oh God, like this didn't work. I'm still here. You know, honestly, you just are overcome with this very strong feeling of disappointment. Like, you mean to tell me this didn't work? You know? And you're just like, wow, I really am good for nothing. Even the easiest thing to do, which is take myself out, I couldn't successfully do that, you know? Like, because remember, your mind at that point, you're not thinking proper. So you just are really overcome with just this heavy feeling of disappointment that like, and then at that point, you're also like, oh my gosh, now I have to keep living this life just with the memory of how tough it was, and you had thought you were now like getting a break, and you're just like, oh my God, we're back. You know, it's for me, I was just heavily disappointed in that moment. I was just like, oh God, I have to keep doing this, you know. At that point, it hadn't quite sunk in that like I had truly had a second chance, and that was a good thing. That came later, but in that moment, I was just like quite upset. But anyway, I was in the ICU for a while. Then when I was stable enough, the doctors moved me to like now just a regular room, like a regular ward. And then collectively, I think I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks. But then now the day after I was moved from like the intensive care is when now a psychiatrist came to the room and now started to have conversations with me. And they're like, what do you last remember? And, you know, they're just trying to kind of figure out, was it actually a case of attempted suicide? Like, because they need to gather, like, if their suspicions are true. So they're going to ask you questions like, you know, what is the last thing you remember? Then when I guess my doctor had gotten the idea that, yeah, I was actually trying to take my life, then they try to kind of understand, okay, what led you to that point, you know? And then for me, in that conversation is where they also told me that actually, Waringa, you are depressed. You actually, because then they started to ask me what are some of the things I had been feeling, just trying to get a sense of what have you been like before you got to that point. So I was describing essentially the things that I spoke about earlier, you know. And then he's like, yeah, you know, Waringa, you're actually dealing with a case of depression. And then they start to explain what is depression, start to tell you that you can actually get better, that kind of thing. And for me, that was the first time that I actually had an official name for what I was going through. Because the whole time I was dealing with it in silence, it was just suspicions. I'm like, yeah, maybe I might be depressed. But what is that really? Like, no, I'm not depressed. It can't be. Anyway, so I spent time at the hospital. I was still on the heart medication. I was still doing a lot of physio because I needed to kind of resuscitate this leg because it wasn't quite working very well. So I needed to do a lot of physio at the hospital just to kind of bring it back and then be able to walk on it again, like properly and be stable on it because I wasn't able like those first few days. So after I left the hospital, I was discharged and I had to go now to like a wellness center or like rehab, whatever you want to call it. Went to that and stayed there for about, I think it was like 2.5 weeks. And that happened to be my most different Christmas and New Year ever because I spent it in rehab. But yeah, that's definitely a Christmas and New Year's that I will never forget because it just felt so different to not be home with family, doing the things that you would traditionally be doing on Christmas or New Year's, but you're now here in like a rehab center, and that is your reality for that time. So that was December of 2019 for me, honestly. So I went to the rehab, I guess, to help me recover holistically. So it was for the depression, for the anxiety, and also just for the substance abuse, and also just time to actually absorb everything that had happened. Because at the time I had attempted to take my own life. I had done it in my apartment, so I couldn't go back to the same apartment. And then I also just felt maybe I just needed time alone. But then my family wouldn't agree that the time alone would be back at the same apartment where all this drama had just happened. So the compromise was, okay, fine, you're gonna go to rehab. So yeah, I went to the wellness center and I was there for a while. And it was an interesting time, but honestly for me, the healing didn't quite happen at the healing center, to be honest. The healing for me happened way later, because yes, I had been told that I am dealing with a case of depression and that I'm living with anxiety, and kind of, actually at that point I hadn't even come to a place of acceptance that I was an addict, okay? So you couldn't have told me that I was an addict at that point. No, that, in fact, I would have felt very insulted. Like, how dare you, you know? So, and I guess that was a bit part of my resistance to the idea of me going to a rehab or a wellness center. I was like, but like, I'm not an addict. Let me just pop these pills from the house, you know, type of thing. Like, this medication you're giving me, I can take it from the house. Why are you guys taking me to a rehab center? I don't have a drinking problem, you know? And so that's what I mean. Like, the healing for me didn't happen there, because sometimes it just takes longer for you to accept certain harsh realities, okay? So honestly, even the medication I was given for the depression and the anxiety, I wasn't very religious with taking it at the time. Like, soon as I was out of the hospital and soon as I was out of that healing center, the rehab, I stopped taking the medication, because I was like, I guess a part of me was still like, no, but you don't have a problem. You're not okay. I mean, you're not okay, like you're fine. I guess I was, you can call it, I was in denial, you know? So I kind of just rushed back to life as usual, you know? I was like, yeah, I'm okay, I'm fine. But you're not, because you still haven't actually dealt with your issues, you know? You just had a major bump in the road, but you didn't actually confront whatever the issues were, you know? So I continued just living life as usual until sometime in 2021, like mid-2021, and I was just like, yeah, something has got to change, you know? Because it's at that point where I started to notice that, one, I was drinking a bit too much. Like, that's the season where I was waking up and picking up a drink like at 6 in the morning. Like, that's a problem, you know? But it was after months of doing that I was able to like look myself in the mirror and be like, actually, Waringa, this is not normal, and you need to actually heal. You need to fix yourself, you know? And so for me, that was like, okay, I'm going to give this healing a good shot. And at this time, when I was coming to this realization that I wasn't okay, I was just feeling like I was drowning. I was starting to really feel like I wasn't okay. And then when I noticed at some point in 2021, I started to notice that like the thoughts of self-harm and suicide were coming back. And for me, that was enough to put the fear of God in me. And I was like, I need to talk to someone, you know? I still didn't know if I could just go and tell someone like, okay, like, do I go and tell someone, hi, I'm having suicidal thoughts again? Like, who do I go to? What do I say? Like, I was still very stuck. So I kept thinking, okay, let me just think about it. Let me see who I'm gonna talk to and how this is gonna play out. One time, I invite my cousin invites me to lunch, and we meet up, and all of a sudden, in the middle of our conversation, I just started crying. Like, not sobbing, crying, like wailing, crying. And she's just like, what's happening? So she just watched me cry. I think I cried for almost like an hour. And you know, it's those vigorous cries. You know, have you ever cried until you're shaking? Like I was just, I don't know. It just hit me all of a sudden. And I was just like, I don't know. And I guess for me, that was literally my cry for help, you know? So, and I'm glad it happened in her presence because I tell her all the time, and I don't think she understands or appreciates when I tell her that like she actually literally saved my life. So I cry, and I have my moment, and she just sits through it. She was very gracious with me. She sat through it. She just was holding my hand, and she was just like, it's okay, it's okay. Like, you know? And I think I cried for at least an hour. And then after that, I calmed down. And she was, and I didn't want to talk after that. And she was like, it's okay. Then, because me, I'm very good at something will happen. And after that, I'll act like I'm okay. So after my whole hour of crying, I was like, yeah, I'm fine. But like, she knew I was not okay. So she humored me anyway. We proceeded to have our lunch. And she dropped me off at home. And then the next day she calls me and she's like, you know, I love you very much. And I was like, yeah, where is this going? And she goes like, you know, yesterday, you know, I gathered that maybe something might not be okay. And I don't know what it is. And you don't have to open up to me about it. But I have someone who I think might be helpful. And she's like, I've texted you her number right before I called you. And I've also asked her to call you in the next 10 minutes. And you just go see her. Don't worry. So I'm like, okay, fine. And she's like, okay, well, let me just tell you. I've kind of found a therapist. And I just want you to go and see them. And they're very nice. Just go see them. And don't worry, I've already like covered the first 10 sessions. And you know what? I just started crying again. I was like, oh my God, but why did you do that? Like in a nice way. I felt so happy that someone was seeing me and like was helping me. So I think for me, that was just a moment of perfect alignment in the sense that within myself, I was ready for healing and I had someone to kind of hold my hand and help me through it. And I also had now the resources that I needed, but most importantly, like I was ready. Like I was in that mind frame as well. So I went to start seeing the therapist. Believe you me, I was in such a bad spot. My first meeting with the therapist, all I did was cry. You know how you go to a doctor's office and you have to fill in that basic information form like, oh, what's your name? What's your age? Family history? What medication are you on? That kind of thing. We couldn't even get through that form. That's like how low or like how vulnerable I was. Like, I just cried for the whole hour. And she's like, oof, this is, yeah. So she recommended me to a psychiatrist who, oh my gosh, between my therapist and my psychiatrist, oh my gosh, those people have really like gotten me from so far. So she was like, you need to go to this psychiatrist before our next session, which I did because I was really ready for this journey. So I was like, whatever the therapist says to do, I'll do. Whatever the psychiatrist says to do, I'll do. So when she said go to the psychiatrist, I was like, I'll be there. So I go see my psychiatrist. And he, of course, when you start seeing a psychiatrist, they have to do that official like assessment to kind of figure out exactly what are you dealing with. So we do the assessment and he gives me an official diagnosis for depression and anxiety. And he determined a treatment plan for me. So the treatment plan that he determined would be best for me at the time was putting me on meds. So he put me on antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. So my treatment plan was basically being on meds and also being in therapy. So then I went back to my therapist and for the therapy part, I had to go once a week. And therapy is where all the healing happens, to be honest. Like the medicine is good, but the therapy is what I think for me makes all the difference because you get to the root cause of whatever is driving whatever illnesses you're dealing with. So for me, I was able to now get to the bottom of what was driving my depression, what was driving my anxiety, what was driving my substance abuse. And actually, I realized that the more I was in therapy and the more I was talking about these issues that I was not dealing with and just now kind of confronting them in therapy, even the desire to use substances just kind of fell away because I was actually dealing with the root cause. And that makes me want to say that, like, sometimes if you have someone in your life who's like dealing with addiction, I think sometimes we stop and just see that person as an addict, and that's all we see them as. But you have to kind of be intentional about going under the surface. Just peel back a little and try to understand what is actually driving that addiction. Because nobody wakes up and decides, yeah, today I'm going to be an alcoholic, or today I'm going to be hooked on cocaine, or today I'm going to be using meth. No, it's being driven by something. And for me, the substance abuse was a crutch for my depression and the anxiety, and just dealing with the things that were also driving those. So the minute I went to therapy and started to, like an onion, just remove the layers, I started to actually get better in every way. And one of the things I really started to notice is, like, even the desire to drink and smoke just gradually started to just disappear because I was actually confronting the root causes that were driving the addiction, that were making the depression like intensify and just never end, type of thing, that were making me live in a constant state of anxiety because I was now kind of, making peace with a lot of things. I know sometimes people are scared to go to therapy because you're like, oh, you're going to be going and sharing your problems with the world. Like, now you're just going to pay to talk to someone. Oh, like now, like what is speaking about this thing going to do? It will do wonders. In fact, right now, I'm like, everybody needs a therapist. It's like the same way you service your car every 3 months, please service your mind and your soul with the same commitment as well. I think that's what therapy is for. Having gone through just the ringer of mental health illness, having been in the dumps of it, like being in the dumps of depression, being in the dumps of anxiety, having lived with substance abuse for a long time, like, I really deeply understand how lonely that journey can be. I know how afraid you can be, how, like, it's a very difficult space to be in. And that's why I'm so passionate about using my experience or just my story and what I've been through to help others who might also be going through it. And for me, that looks like sharing these stories. So for me, having made the progress I've made on my healing journey, now I feel like I'm at a point where I want to open up this conversation about all things mental health to other people as well, to those people who might be on their healing journey, so that they are not feeling so alone and so afraid and feeling like I can't recover from this, And for me, that meant having a space where we can talk about these things, where people are empowered with information about mental health. And that's why I started my channel, Mental Safe Space. Number one, it's a space for those who are also on their healing journey to feel seen, to feel heard, and to feel deeply, deeply, deeply understood. Because oftentimes when you're battling a mental health illness, those are the things you need. So Mental Safe Space is also a space for people who maybe might be caring for a loved one who has one kind of mental health illness or the other. So it's a space where you, as a caregiver, as a friend, as a loved one, as a brother, as a sister to someone who is battling a mental health illness, say depression, you can come and kind of, through hearing some of the stories that we share on the channel, you're able to kind of get a glimpse into some of the realities that your loved one might be going through. And then in that way, you're empowered to know how to take care of them a little bit better, know how to show up for them in the ways that matter, just help you understand their reality, some of which they're not able to express to you directly. Because sometimes when people are going through a mental health illness, as I was not very forthcoming with information, you know, like, so sometimes your loved one will not come to you and tell you, hey, I need help, or come and tell you, hey, I'm feeling this way and that way, because just like me, maybe they're in a space in their healing journey where they're still feeling very ashamed, or they're feeling very fearful of even accepting the fact that they might just be dealing with a mental health illness. So I hope that by having these conversations, we're able to empower each other with the information that we need, because information is king. When you have information, you're so empowered to not only know how to show up for your loved ones, but to also spot things in people around you and direct them to the correct resources. Like my cousin was able to direct me to the resources that I actually needed to really start my healing journey. And that's why we need to normalize conversations about mental health, so that it stops becoming something that's so like untouchable, something that we don't talk about, we don't address it, we don't speak about it. No, we need to really just talk about it, understand it, and just empower ourselves with the information that we need, so that our loved ones are not suffering in silence, so that we're not waking up to news of suicides every day, which have become so common that like it's almost, it's sad how regular cases of suicide have become. We hear it almost, it's like, oh yeah, just another day in, I don't know, Nairobi, just another rainy day in Nakuru, you know? That's how common they've become. You know, a lot of times when suicide happens, people are so shocked. They're like, but this person, why did they do that? But like, when you're empowered with the information you need, you can actually see the signs before it happens. And that's why you need to equip yourself with this information, so that you're not there being shocked when your brother, your sister, your cousin has taken their own life. You don't have to be shocked. You can instead be in the position where you have the information and you're able to see it before it happens. You're able to support them when they actually need you. They don't need your support when they're dead, but they need you when they're still here and suffering. And that's why we need to talk about these things. So I welcome you to check out my YouTube channel, Mental Safe Space, where we talk about all things mental health. So we usually have new conversations every Wednesday. So come join me. Let's have this honest, raw, and vulnerable conversations about mental health. And you don't have to be going through a mental health illness for you to be part of the conversation. Everybody needs to be having conversations about mental health. We need to normalize these conversations in our families, at our working places, with those around us, with our loved ones. Let's normalize conversations around mental health so we're able to support each other better and show up for those who are battling mental health illnesses in the ways that truly matter and in the ways that they will receive it. So I really look forward to engaging with you over on Mental Safe Space. Welcome, and join us for new chats every Wednesday. I'll see you there.